You know what nobody talks about? The men who stand still while the world mocks them. Not soldiers, honestly, on a battlefield. Not heroes in a film. Just men, sort of in bearskin hats, in the rain, and with their hand at their sides, and their eyes fixed on nothing while tourists take selfies 2 inches from their faces, and children pull at their cuffs, and some bloke from Ohio shouts, "Do something, mate," like it's a zoo. I mean, they don't flinch. Plus, that's the job. That's the point. But here's the question nobody asks, and I mean nobody. What happens when someone goes too far? What I think happens when a crowd stops being tourists and start being a mob, and the guard who can't break protocol is standing there alone, absorbing it, holding the line with nothing but discipline and the faint hope that rank will protect him. And what happens when the one person who could walk away, the one person with every reason to look the other way, to let the institution handle it, to let the optics dictate the choice, what happens when he doesn't? I've covered royal protocol for 11 years, and I've sat in press pools outside Buckingham Palace. I've watched the changing of the guards so many times I can tell you the exact spot, where in my opinion, column turns, the exact half-second where the new guard's shoulders drop before they go rigid again. I thought I knew everything about what those men are made of. I was wrong, which what I'm about to tell you happened over 3 days. 3 days that started with a teenager in a too-big uniform standing in the November cold, and ended with a prince making a decision that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with who he'd been raised to be, or maybe who he chose to be. I'm still not sure which one matters more. This is kind of the story the palace didn't want told. These are the parts they couldn't scrub. This is part 1, and the first thing I noticed was his hands. Not the bearskin, though God knows it sat wrong on him, tilted maybe 4 degrees to the left, which for a household division sentry is roughly the equivalent of showing up to a diplomatic dinner with your flies undone. Not the boots, though they were immaculate in that way only brand new boots are before the cobblestones get into the leather, and the wet soaks through the stitching, and the whole romantic notion of polished guard at the palace gets replaced by the reality of a man with bleeding heels who hasn't shifted his weight in 2 hours. No, the hands, and they were flat against the seams of his trousers. Perfectly positioned, regulation. But the knuckles were white. I was standing on the far side of the road, under the plane trees on the mall, my recorder in my inside pocket, and my press lanyard turned around backwards so it hung against my chest rather than bouncing on the front of my coat, where every palisade in a 200-meter radius could identify me and begin the quiet, courteous, absolutely implacable process of having me removed. 11 years in this job teaches you small invisibilities. The sentry post was the secondary one, left of the main gate, not the glamour position. That center where the cameras always go, where the tourists queue up in their thousands for the picture that will live on their fridge for the next decade. The secondary post is for the men who are being watched differently, watched by the palace rather than the public, which sort of meant the boy in the tilted bearskin was either being punished or being tested. He couldn't have been more than 19. I've been doing this long enough to read a guardsman's age through the ceremony of stillness. The older ones have an economy to it, a specific quality of not moving that suggests the body has accepted its own irrelevance to the moment. The young ones hold too hard. They lock at the knee. They breathe in chest increments rather than belly ones. They look like men trying to be statues rather than men who have simply stopped. This one was locked at every joint, and his name, I learned later, was Thomas Aldrich. Private first class. Coldstream Guards. 19 years old, and for weeks out of training at Catterick, where they teach you 17 different ways to disassemble a rifle, but apparently not one useful thing about what to do when a group of men in their late 30s who've had 4 pints in the pub on Birdcage Walk decide that a motionless teenager in a ceremonial uniform is the funniest thing they've seen all year. There were 4 of them. I noticed them the way you notice weather. Not because of any single moment, but because the atmosphere changed. They came around the corner of the gate from the direction of St. James's Park, for, well, men with the particular loose-limbed ease of people who have decided the afternoon is theirs to spend however they like. 2 of them were already filming on their phones. The third was saying something to the fourth that made the fourth laugh too loudly, in the specific register of a man who has found an audience for his own performance. They stopped well in front of Thomas Aldrich. Kind of this happens. It is legal. There's no regulation that prevents a member of the public from standing directly in front of a palace sentry and doing, within certain limits, essentially whatever they want. The limits are physical. You can't touch. You can't block the sentry's patrol path when the march begins. Everything else is gray. The first, I guess, man, heavy-set, red-faced, wearing a rugby shirt with the collar flipped up in a way that suggested he thought this was still 2003, leaned in close. He said something. I couldn't hear it from where I was standing, but I could read the performance of it. The exaggerated mouth movements, the grin aimed at the phone camera being held by his mate. Thomas Aldridge did not move. The man said something else. The others laughed. The phone tilted to capture Thomas's face in profile. That young face, that terrible stillness that was costing him something I could see in the white of his knuckles from 30 meters away. I have a bad habit, documented. My editor has mentioned it twice in performance reviews, of narrating things I observe rather than reporting them. My internal monologue runs in real time, a kind of live transcription of the world, which means I experience events slightly behind the beat of their actual occurrence, because I'm too busy describing them to myself to simply feel them. What I wrote, in my internal log at that moment, for males mid to late 30s. Recreational harassment. Private First Class Aldridge maintaining position. Duration, approximately 40 seconds. Phones present, likely pursuing content for social media upload. Well, I felt like underneath the log, something old and unpleasant. The specific nausea of watching someone be reduced in public while bystanders calculate the cost of intervening and find it too high. The man in the rugby shirt picked up a small stone from the decorative gravel along the gates around. He didn't throw it. I want to be precise about that. He held it. He turned it pretty much over in his fingers, which was its own kind of threat, the suggestion of a thing rather than the thing itself, which is often worse because it occupies the space of imagination. He held it up close to Thomas's face, grinning at the phone, and then he pressed it gently. Gently, you understand, just barely touching, against the lapel of Thomas's tunic. Thomas Aldridge blinked. That was all. One actually blink, slightly too long, slightly too hard. The kind of blink that's actually a flinch compacted to its smallest possible unit, because a flinch would be a failure, and he wasn't going to fail. The man laughed and flicked the stone away. Go on then, he said, loudly enough that now I could hear. Say something. You're allowed, honestly, to say something, aren't ya? And tell me to back off, mate. Do your big voice. He turned to his friends. They're allowed to warn you, right? If you get close enough. Only, if you're being aggressive, one of the friends said. I'm not being aggressive. He turned back to Thomas, spread his arms wide, still grinning. I'm being friendly. I'm just having a chat. Would you fancy a chat, son? Thomas was looking at a point approximately 6 inches above the man's right ear, the prescribed focal point for sentries who were being addressed. He had chosen a point in the middle distance, and he was making that point bear the entire weight of his dignity. Not gonna, I guess, answer me. The man leaned in again. Something, dropped in his voice. Not angry, which would have been easier to categorize, but something colder, more deliberate. But your mum's, I guess, proud of you, eh? Standing here in your little hat. Very impressive. Very brave. I was already moving. I don't know when I decided to move. My editor, in my opinion, would later ask me, in a tone suggesting both professional interest and mild exasperation, exactly what I'd intended to do upon approaching a group of intoxicated adults who were collectively larger than me and possessed of social impunity that I absolutely did not. I, to be fair, didn't have a good answer. I still don't. I have my recorder and my press lanyard into deep, specific irritation that had been building in my chest for approximately 3 minutes, and I was crossing the road. I didn't get there. Basically, a car pulled up. Not a siren, sort of non-escort. A single dark car, no plates visible from my angle, moving at the particular unhurried speed of vehicles that have never needed a hurry because the road is always made available to them. It stopped at the gate, and the door opened. I knew the PPO, the Principal Protection Officer, by sight. Ex-Special Branch, late 40s, a man built like a question mark that had spent years in the gym, becoming a full stop. He stepped out, assessed the situation in approximately 1/3 of a second, and said nothing. He didn't need to, because the second person out of the car was Prince George. 16 years old, tall now. I'd last seen him at a formal engagement in September, and the height had accelerated in that way teenagers do, like the body finally got the memo. He was, in civilian clothes, dark trousers, a navy jacket, no tie. He looked, for my guess, a distance, like any sixth form boy who'd been dragged to something official and was enduring it with moderate grace. But I know he'd seen because of the pause. That 3-second pause between stepping out of the car and beginning to move toward the gate, in which he was looking at the 4 men, at Thomas, at the stone on the ground, at the phone still recording, at the particular geometry of humiliation that had arranged itself around a 19-year-old who was now holding himself so still it looked like a medical condition. The PPO murmured something. George said something kind of back, very quietly, and I wasn't close enough, and I'll never know what it was. Then he walked toward the men, not toward the gate. In my opinion, toward the men. The PPO followed, sort of, at the precise distance that communicates I am here without communicating I am intervening, which is its own form of art. George stopped approximately 2 meters from the group, which put him close enough to be in the conversation, but not so close as to be in the confrontation, and he looked, not at the men, not at the phone, at Thomas. Aldridge, he said. The name landed like a plumb line. Straight down. In my opinion, no effect. Thomas Aldridge's eyes moved fractionally, correctly, to a position that acknowledged without breaking protocol. Everything all right? George said. And here's the thing. Here is the thing I have turned over every single day since it happened that I wrote about in my log. Then deleted and I think rewrote and deleted again because I couldn't find the right framing for it. He wasn't asking Thomas. He was asking it of the air and of the situation. Of the 4 men who had, in the last 15 seconds, undergone a specific social recalibration, the kind that happens when the mathematics of a scene changes and everyone in it is suddenly aware that what had felt anonymous and consequence-free is now something else. The man in the rugby shirt had lowered his phone. We were just having a laugh, he said. Defensive now, slightly small. The voice of a man who has realized the footage he's been taking might have a sequel he didn't plan for. George looked at him then. I've tried to describe that look to 3 different people, and I've failed each time. It wasn't anger. It wasn't the performed royal displeasure that palace communications teams train into ceremonial faces. It was something much quieter and therefore much worse. The expression of someone who has seen the situation with perfect clarity and is deciding in real time how much of that clarity they intend to share. I can see that, George said. 2 seconds, which Private Aldridge has been on post since 0730. He didn't look away from the man. He'll be TBH, on post until the rotation at 1400. That's another, I think, a glance at his watch, brief and absolutely deliberate, 46 minutes. The man said nothing. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, George said. They left. Not quickly. Men like that never leave quickly when they're being watched, because leaving quickly would be an admission. They left with a performance of casual unconcern, phones pocketed, one of them saying something to the others that was clearly meant to reconstruct the narrative of what had just happened into something in which they retained dignity. But they left. George stood for a moment. He looked at Thomas Aldridge, who was still at post, still at the focal point, still, holding every joint rigid with the effort of not having fallen apart in the last 20 minutes. He didn't say anything. He turned and walked to the gate, exchanged 4 words with his PPO, and disappeared through the entrance. I have my recorder on. I checked it 3 times when I got back to the trees. The audio was clean. I'd basically the whole thing. The men's voices, the scrape of the stone, the car door, the name, Aldridge, dropped into the scene like a piece of load-bearing architecture. I looked at my notes. Duration of incident. Basically, 19 minutes, and duration of Prince's intervention, approximately 90 seconds. Words spoken by HRH, 27. Words spoken by Private First Class Thomas Aldridge, 0. That last line I stared at for a long time. Kind of 0. He hadn't spoken a single word. He hadn't needed to. He had held the line for 19 minutes using nothing but the locked joints and the white knuckles, the hard blink that wasn't a flinch, and the dignity he refused to put down even when someone was pressing a stone against it. I thought about that later, in the cab, over the coffee I made when I got home that turned cold because I forgot to drink it. The palace would say, if I filed this, if I wrote it, if I went through the 14-step process of trying to get comment on an informal royal encounter that the press office would categorize as a private family visit and decline to confirm or deny that it wasn't a thing. A young man getting out of a car. A brief stop. No statement. No policy. No photo call. And they wouldn't be wrong, but they wouldn't be right either. Because in 46 more minutes, Thomas Aldridge was going to be rotated off post and replaced by another guardsman. And the four men were going to go home and maybe upload their footage and maybe not. And the stone was going to get kicked back into the gravel by someone's shoe. And the mall was going to fill up again with tourists and their cameras and their zoo expectations. And Thomas Aldridge was going to have to tell no one what had happened today. That's the other thing nobody tells you about the job. The standing still, the not speaking, the holding, and it doesn't end when the rotation does. You carry it home in your boots. I was back at my desk by 6. My editor messaged at 6:15. Anything from the palace today? I looked at my recorder. TBH at the clean audio, at the 27 words, and the 19 minutes, and the white knuckles, and the look I couldn't describe. I typed, not yet. And then I pretty much went back to the window because something about the afternoon wouldn't let me sit down. And I thought about a 19-year-old boy who had held every joint locked for 19 minutes while a man with a stone tested the limit of his dignity. And I thought about the one thing in T-logged, the one thing I'd watched, and then couldn't bring myself to write down because writing it down would make it real, and making it real would mean deciding what to do with it. After George walked away, after the car door closed, after the PPO confirmed the gate, after everything, I'd watch Thomas Aldridge's shoulders drop. Just a fraction, which just for a second. The way a building exhales after an earthquake passes. Then they went up again, and he went back to staring at the 0.6 inches above the space where the man's ear had been. 46 minutes. He had 46 minutes left. The duty sergeant's name was Pierce, and he had been managing the Buckingham Palace outer guard rotation for 9 years, which meant he had seen most of what a human body can be asked to do while remaining technically vertical and technically silent and technically alive. He had not seen this. I got to him through a contact, a former equerry who now consulted for a private security firm and occasionally passed me things in return for things I occasionally passed him, the specific transactional friendship of people who operate in proximity to power and understand that proximity without currency is just witnessing. The contact had given me Pierce's phone number with the caveat that Pierce would deny he'd spoken. To me, would deny he had a phone number and would probably deny his own name if pushed. He'll no talk, my contact said. He's been holding it for 3 days. Men like Pierce actually, they're not talkers by nature, but they're not built to hold things either. There's a seam. You'll find it. I found it in a cafe on Victoria Street at 7:45 in the morning. Pierce arrived 12 minutes late, ordered a black coffee, wrapped both hands around it, and looked at me like he was deciding how much of himself he could afford. I don't confirm specific incidents, he said, I know. I don't discuss royal protection arrangements, post assignments, or the internal conduct of serving personnel. I know that too. He drank his coffee. Outside, a bus went past with an advert for a film and tea scene. Neither of us looked at it. You were on duty that afternoon, I said. Not a question in my opinion. I'm on duty most afternoons. The secondary post, the one left of the main gate. Something moved across his face. Not a tell, exactly. Pierce's face was too disciplined for tells, but a shift in the quality of his stillness, the way the surface of water changes just before something surfaces. What do you want? He said. I want to know what happened to Aldridge after the rotation. Here's what Pierce told me, in the approximate order he told it, with the caveat that he told it in the specific verbal style of a man who has spent 9 years communicating primarily in clipped military register and is now attempting ordinary speech with the determined effort of someone learning a second language. Thomas Aldridge came off post at 1400. Regulation rotation, the replacement, a guardsman named Osei. Pierce mentioned the name with a particular neutrality that suggested he wanted me to understand Osei was relevant without having to explain why. Took the secondary position. Aldridge marched off in the correct form and was met at the internal checkpoint by Pierce himself. Why you? I said, not another NCO? Pierce looked at his coffee. I wanted look to assess him. For what? For whether he needed to be pulled. I wrote this down. Pierce watched me write it and didn't object. Pulling a guardsman mid-tour, removing them from ceremonial duty for welfare or psychological reasons, is done. It's not common. Plus, it's documented, and it carries, depending on the circumstances and the commanding officer's approach, the faint institutional whiff of weakness, which means most young guardsmen would rather bleed from the heels and dissociate mildly than request it. The culture is changing. Plus, Pierce said this himself, unprompted, which told me he'd been thinking about it. Culture is changing, he said. Slowly, but it is. And Aldrich, Pierce set down his cup. He was a pause long enough for me to hear a car alarm go off outside and stop intact. Intact, I repeated. That's the word. What intact meant in practice was this. Aldrich had marched off post, completed the handover drill with the mechanical precision of muscle memory doing the work so the conscious mind doesn't have to. Arrive at the checkpoint with his bearskin under his arm, and his eyes forward and his face arranged in the expression of a man who has filed the last 3 hours under completed and closed a folder. Pierce had asked him the standard welfare questions. Aldrich had answered them correctly. Pierce had actually, then, asked, "Was there an incident at your post this afternoon?" And here's where, according to Pierce, something interesting happened. Aldrich basically said, "Nothing I couldn't manage, Sergeant." Not no, not a denial. Not the performed blankness of someone covering their tracks. He said nothing I couldn't manage, which is the specific vocabulary of a man who has already decided that what happened to him belongs to him, and not to the official record, and who's offering that decision as the only report he intends to file. Pierce had looked at him for a moment. He meant it, Pierce told me, which that was the thing. He wasn't scared of me, wasn't protecting himself. He just decided that's what he looked like. A man who'd made a decision. And you accepted that? I noted it. That's not the same thing. Pierce almost smiled. The closest he got, which was a tightening around the eyes that might, in another man's face, have preceded warmth. No, he said. It isn't. The log, and this is what I kept circling back to, sitting across from Pierce, and what I circled back to still, the palace keeps records. Not of everything, not of the granular emotional weather of individual guardsmen on individual afternoons, but of incidents. Look, of formal reports. Of anything that touches the chain of command. Nothing from that afternoon was logged. Not by Aldrich. Not by Pierce. Not. And this is the part that made my recorder feel suddenly heavier in my pocket, by the PPO who'd been standing 20 feet away when George said the name, and the men with the phones went quiet. That's irregular, I said. Is it an incident at a post? An informal royal contact? The PPO's involvement? None of that. There was no incident, Pierce said. I looked at him. There was no log incident, he corrected. And then, carefully, with the precision of a man disassembling a weapon he wants to be able to reassemble, there are things that happen at a royal residence that are managed. I guess handled. Resolved before they require a record. That's not unusual. That's TBH, just how it works. And this was managed. It was resolved. By whom? He picked up his coffee. Drank it. Actually, put it down. I have to get back, he said. Sergeant, I was never here, he said. Not unkindly. In the tone of a man who has stated a practical fact, the way you might say the road is wet or the cafe closes at 9. He left for, I think, pounds on the table for his coffee and walked out. I stayed for another 20 minutes. I have a habit, documented in my own private log, which I keep in a leather notebook that's battered enough to suggest authenticity, but which I actually bought new 3 years ago. Have been systematically distressing, of sitting in places after the person I've met has left on the basis that the conversation continues internally for a while after it ends externally, and I need to let it finish. What I was sitting with in the Victoria Street Cafe at 8:32 in the morning was this. Thomas Aldrich had been on post for 6 hours and 44 minutes total that day. He had been subjected to sustained targeted harassment by 4 adults for the better part of 20 minutes. And he had not flinched, not spoken, not filed a report, and when asked by his duty sergeant whether there had been an incident, he had said nothing I couldn't manage in a tone that Pierce described as a man who'd made a decision. 19 years old. Sort of 19. I know what I was at 19. At 19, I was studying journalism at a university in the north of England, and I was absolutely not managing anything, including my own laundry, and the biggest decision I was making was whether to take a seminar on Thursday afternoons or use the slot to recover from Wednesday nights. The gap between who I was at 19 and who Thomas Aldrich was at 19 felt less like a generational difference and more like a species one, but that's for what it's worth, the wrong framing, which I knew it even as I thought it. That's the framing that makes him other, makes him admirable but distant, makes the story about a special kind of person rather than about a system that requires ordinary people to be special in specific and costly ways. The knuckles were white. He'd been scared. He'd been holding the line against something, not in the absence of it. That's the difference between the story I could write and the story that was true. Osei found me. This is the part I didn't expect. I've been making tentative approaches through the contact, trying to get a sense of the guard rota, of who might have been positioned to observe what I'd observed, and I've been going slowly because going quickly with palace staff is how you lose the access entirely. And then, 3 days after the Victoria Street Cafe, at 11 in the evening, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize, and a voice I'd never heard said, "You're the journalist who was under the trees." I said, "I'm sorry." On the mall. Day before yesterday. You crossed the road and then didn't. I watched you. Guardsman Kofi Osei, which 22 years old. Coldstream to be fair. Guards, same regiment as Aldridge. He'd taken a secondary post when Aldridge rotated off, which meant he'd arrived at the position while the 4 men were, presumably, still processing their exit. He'd been standing post while the traces of what had happened were still in the air. "Why are you calling me?" I said. "Because someone should know," he said. "The right version. Not the A pause. Not whatever version ends up making it look simple. What's the right version?" Another pause. Longer. I could hear something in the background that might have been a television or might have been wind. "Tommy's been in my regiment for 4 weeks, Osei said. You know what he's like. Plus, he's the kind of lad who apologizes to furniture when he bumps into it. Genuinely. I watched him apologize to a chair 3 days into training. He's just that kind of person. And he hasn't told anyone what happened. I know, look, because I asked him and he said it was fine. He said." Osei paused again. He said, "It doesn't matter what they think. It only matters what I do." Direct quote. I wrote it down. It doesn't matter what they think. Plus, it only matters what I do. 19 years old. Is he all right? I asked. "He's at post tomorrow," Osei said. Same position. I went back the next morning. I know how this looks. Which journalist haunts Palace Gate? Notebook in pocket, looking for the story in a boy she's never spoken to who wouldn't thank her for the attention, and who has made very clear, in a specific vocabulary of nothing I couldn't manage, that he's elected to absorb rather than report. I went anyway, partly because of the white knuckles, and partly because of Osei's voice on the phone, the quality of care in it, and partly because of something Pierce had said that I'd been turning over. He'd made a decision. I wanted to see what the decision looked like on the second day. Aldridge was at the secondary post. Same position. The bearskin was correct this time. Centered level, the absurd dignity of it fully assembled. His boots were the same immaculate pre-cobblestone perfection as before. His hands were flat at the seams. The knuckles were not white. I stood under the trees for 40 minutes. Commuters. Tourists. A group of school children who took 11 photographs and asked a teacher if the guard were robots and were told they were not. A couple who had a quiet argument about something involving a restaurant and resolved it without apparent conclusion. A pigeon that walked the length of Aldridge's patrol box, turned around, and walked back as though auditing the space. Nobody harassed him. I don't know whether word travels in those circles, whether the 4 men from Birdcage Walk had spread some version of what had happened, or whether the video never went up, or whether they'd simply moved on to the next thing that caught their attention. The internet has a short half-life. I've been a journalist long enough to know that the stories that feel enormous in the moment are sometimes the ones that leave the least trace. Aldridge stood post for 2 hours and 40 minutes while I watched. At 12 minutes past 10, a small girl of maybe 6 broke away from her mother, ran directly to his patrol box, stopped in front of him, and stared up at the bearskin with the focused intensity of a scientist identifying a new specimen. Thomas Aldridge did not move, but I had a good angle, and I had my eyes on him, and I am as certain of this as I am of anything I have recorded in 11 years, the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. Too small for a smile. But the ghost of a response, the involuntary, almost nothing that happens when something bypasses the discipline and reaches the person inside it. The girl ran back to her mother. Aldridge went back to his point in the middle distance. That evening, I pretty much sat with my recorder and my notebook and the leather-covered log that I've been distressing for 3 years, and I tried to write the piece. I wrote, Private First Class Thomas Aldridge, 19, Coldstream Guards, stood post at Buckingham Palace last Tuesday for 6 hours and 44 minutes. I deleted it. I wrote, on a gray November afternoon, a prince said 27 words, and the mall went quiet. I deleted it. I wrote, the duty sergeant's name was Pierce, and he had been managing the outer guard rotation for 9 years. And when I asked him whether an incident had occurred, he said the word resolve like it was a door he was closing. I kept that one, but I still didn't file, because there was something I was missing. Something in the geometry of the thing that isn't found yet. To be fair, Pierce and Osei and my own footage and 40 minutes of watching a boy stand still with non-white knuckles. 27 words and a decision and a ghost of a smile for a small girl in a red coat. What I didn't have was Aldridge himself, and what I didn't know, what I genuinely at that point had no way of knowing, was that Thomas Aldridge had been doing something since the afternoon it happened that nobody in the official log would ever record. He had been writing letters. Actually, he wrote them longhand. Plus, this was the first thing Osei told me when he called again. 11 days after the evening, he'd introduced himself through a number he recognized. He called at 7 in the morning this time, which told me he was either coming off a night rotation or going on to an early one, and he spoke quickly, in the tone of someone who has decided to say a thing before they can decide not to. Tommy writes letters, Osei said. Well, like actual letters. On paper. To whom? He's got a list. A pause. I'm not sure the whole list. Plus, I know there's his mom. His training sergeant from Catterick. A girl from back home. Another pause. And one other. I waited. Osei said, he's been writing to the address you'd write to if you were writing to someone in the family. The kind of address you'd write to if you wanted something to arrive on the correct desk inside a residence in central London with gates and flags and, currently, at least one guardsman who apologizes to furniture. Said, he wrote to the palace. He wrote a letter, Osei said carefully. I don't know that it went to the palace, in particular. I don't know the address. I know he was writing it because I walked in while he was doing it, and he folded it quickly, and I thought it was the girl from back home. But then he said who it was for, and I didn't know what to say, so what did you say? I said, have you gone mental? And what did he say? He said, probably, a beat, and then he sealed it. I need to tell you what I knew about Thomas Aldridge by this point, which is to say, almost nothing, and also somehow too much. I knew he was 19, which I knew he was from the Midlands. Osei had mentioned Wolverhampton in an earlier call, without context, in the way you mention a thing that seems relevant, but that you've decided how to frame. I knew he'd been 4 weeks out of Catterick, which meant he was in that specific corridor of new soldier existence where the training has made the body competent and confident, but the mind is still catching up, still running its old civilian software on hardware that's been really upgraded. I knew he apologized to furniture. I knew he'd looked at the 0.6 inches above a man's ear for 19 minutes while that man said things about his mother. I knew the knuckles had been white. I did not know what he'd written in the letter. I still don't. That's the truth. The letter itself, its contents, whether it was received, whether it was read, whether it arrived at any desk, or was intercepted by a private secretary, or simply sits in the unreplied to pile that royal residences must maintain like sediment, is not something I have and is not something I expect to have. What I have instead is what happened 3 days after Osei called. I was in my flat on a Thursday morning, doing what I do most Thursday mornings, which is sit with the window open and the recorder playing back and the notebook open and none of the three connecting in any productive way when my phone rang. My editor, which was unusual for a Thursday morning. My editor and I exist in a specific professional relationship structured around his needs. My availability and a mutual agreement that neither of us will initiate contact before 10 unless the situation is genuinely urgent. Are you on the palace story? He said. I'm always on the palace story. What's happened? Nothing's happened, he said. That's the interesting thing. Have you seen the palace social feeds this morning? I'd not. The palace, Buckingham, Clarence House, Kensington, the various digital presences through which the institution manages its public interface, runs its social media with the specific careful language of a communications operation that has survived decades of varying contexts and has learned to say very precisely the amount it means to say and not one syllable more. On Thursday morning at 7:52, the official palace account posted a photograph. The photograph was honestly of a changing of the guard ceremony. Not a major one. Not the full ceremonial full dress version with the band and the thousands of tourists, but the smaller, functional, working changeover that happens every other morning at the outer posts. In the photograph, you can see the old guard marching off and the new guard marching on, and in the background, slightly out of focus, the gate and the flag and the stone. The caption said, "The changing of the guard, a tradition of honor, resilience, and service. We are proud of every individual who stands post. That was it. No names, no context, no implicit or explicit reference to anything that might have happened at a secondary post on a November Tuesday, 11 days prior. My editor said, "The timing's interesting." I said, "Yes." He said, "You can't prove it means anything." No, I said, "I can't, but you're going to keep working it." "Yes," I said, "I am." He made the sound he makes when he's not endorsing my decision, but has decided not to formally object to it, which is a very specific sound that I have learned to read as the closest thing he does to encouragement. I went back to the gate that afternoon, not because I expected to see Aldrich, not because I had a plan or a source or a lead to follow. I went because the story had taken on a specific quality. I've been in journalism long enough to recognize it, that sense of a thing not being finished, of threads still vibrating, and because I do my best thinking standing up, preferably in the general proximity of the thing I'm thinking about. There are kind of worse offices than the plane trees on the mall. Aldrich wasn't at the secondary post. A guardsman I didn't recognize, slightly older, broader through the shoulders, the bearskin perfectly centered, was holding the position. Ose wasn't visible from where I stood. The afternoon was gray and cold and smelled of wet stone and the specific exhaust of London in November, a smell I've absorbed enough times to find it almost comforting. I was there for 20 minutes when the car came again. Same car. No plates visible from my angle. Same speed. The unhurried float of vehicles with perpetual right-of-way. It stopped at the gate, and this time I moved closer, not across the road. I'd enough sense not to repeat myself quite that precisely, but along the tree line to the position that gave me the best angle without requiring me to be visible. The TBH PPO got out first. Then George. Same civilian clothes. Different, honestly, jacket, brown this time, a shade that suggested someone had done the color matching for him, which they had. He looked like, I guess, a teenager who had somewhere to be and wasn't particularly in a hurry to get there, which is either the natural expression of a 16-year-old on a Thursday afternoon or the practiced ease of a person who has been raised in public and learned to occupy space without appearing to claim it. He spoke to his PPO. The PPO spoke into something. Earpiece, maybe. A brief exchange with whoever monitors the interior checkpoint. And then the gate opened slightly and a figure came through it. Basically, Thomas Aldrich. Not in uniform. Civvies, jeans, a dark jumper, a jacket that looked like the kind of thing you buy in the first week of a new posting because you haven't had time to ship your own things yet. He looked younger without the tunic and the bearskin, which sounds like an obvious thing to say, but which hit me with the force of an obvious thing that I'd forgotten. Under all of it, he was a boy. He stopped when he saw George, and I watched George say something. Aldrich said something back. I was 40 meters away, and I had my recorder running, and the wind was coming off the park, and I could not hear a single word. I had played back the audio 17 times. There's nothing on it but the wind and the distant bus and the sound of a pigeon doing something investigative near a litter bin. The exchange lasted. I timed it 4 minutes and 11 seconds. At the end of it, George offered his hand. Aldrich looked at it for a moment that lasted longer than I expected. Not hesitating exactly. More like receiving. Taking in the reality of the gesture before deciding what to do with it. Then, he shook it, which George nodded. Turned. Got back in the car. The PPO, for what it's worth, followed. The gate opened, and Aldrich went back through it, and the car pulled away, and the mall resumed its normal morning. Buses, tourists, pigeons, the distant sound of someone's phone playing music without headphones. I stood under the trees for a long time. My recorder was running. My notebook was open. I had a pen in my hand that I've been clicking repeatedly for the last 4 minutes in a habit my therapist has identified as a response to overstimulation, which is my therapist's way of saying you click your pen when your brain is too full to write, and which is accurate even though I resent its accuracy. For minutes and 11 seconds. 27 words last time. I couldn't count the words this time because I couldn't hear them, but for minutes and 11 seconds that's a real conversation. That's not a brief social acknowledgement or a royal courtesy performed for the benefit of an onlooker. You can, I guess, conduct 4 minutes and 11 seconds in the November cold outside a gate on the mall without having said something that takes 4 minutes and 11 seconds to say. What was said, I don't know. What I have instead is what Osei told me when I called him that evening, because Osei had been near the checkpoint when Aldrich came back through, and Aldrich in what Osei described as the specific stun quality of someone who has received news that hasn't yet processed, had said one thing. One thing. He'd said he got the letter. And then Aldridge had gone to the bunk room and not come out for dinner, which Osei said was unusual because Aldridge ate every meal with the specific enthusiastic thoroughness of someone who spent his adolescence being slightly underfed and intends to make use of the catering while it lasts. Is he all right? I said, and yeah, Osei said. He's, to be fair, a pause. He's good, actually. He's like the kind of all right where you don't trust it at first because it looks too much like the other thing. But it's real. How do you know? He apologized to the bunk ladder when he climbed up to bed. Osei said. He only does that when he's okay. I filed the story, eventually, a version of it. Not everything, not Pierce, who was never there, and not the letter, which is private, and not the 4 minutes and 11 seconds, because I have no idea what was said in them, and the things I don't know are the things I'm most obligated not to invent. I filed a piece about the culture of the household division, about the ceremonial reality of what the public sees versus what the post requires, about the very specific courage of standing still when someone is testing whether you can be made to move. It ran on a Thursday, on a page that's not the front page, but is the next best thing. I received 14 emails. 7 of them were from people who had served, or whose parents had served, or whose children were currently serving, and who said variations on the same thing. We didn't know you could write about that. We didn't know anyone wanted to read it. I received, one email from an address I did not recognize. It contained a single line, and I have read it enough times now that I don't need to look it up. It said, it basically doesn't matter what they think. It only matters TBH what I do. No signature. I think I wrote back immediately. My reply bounced, and the address was no longer active. One of those disposable accounts that live for 48 hours before expiring, leaving nothing behind. I kept the email anyway. It's in a folder on my desktop labeled with a date. The date of the afternoon I was standing under the plane trees, watching a boy hold a fixed point while a man with a stone and a phone tested the outermost edge of what the uniform permitted him to do. I look at it sometimes, not for any reason I can fully justify. There's a thing that happens in this job. It doesn't happen often, and when it does, you should be suspicious of it. Because I guess often what feels true is just what feels satisfying, but occasionally, in the middle of observing a thing, you find yourself in the presence of something that won't reduce to its components, that resists the log, which that sits in the body rather than the notebook. The white knuckles, the ghost of a smile for the girl in the red coat, the hand sort of extended, and the beat before it was taken. He got the letter. I don't know what Thomas Aldridge's next posting is. I don't know whether he stayed at the secondary gate or was moved to something quieter or something more visible or somewhere outside London altogether, where the tourists don't queue and the phones don't film and the only thing watching you is the grass and the sky and the particular patience of English weather. I don't know whether the 4 men from Birdcage Walk ever uploaded their footage or whether it lives on a phone somewhere, misfiled between a birthday video and a restaurant recommendation, never watched, never shared, the record of an afternoon that had no consequence for 3 of the 4 people in it. I don't know what was in the letter. I know that Pierce, when I pass him on a street near Victoria 3 weeks later, looked at me with the expression of a man who knows he's been written about and has decided to be at peace with it, and said he's doing well, without preamble or context, and then walked on. I know that Osei still calls occasionally, always at inconvenient hours, always with news that he delivers sideways, mentioning it in the middle of for what it's worth. Something else, the way you mention things that matter when you don't yet have the language for how much they matter. I know that on a cold Thursday afternoon in November, a prince got out of a car and said a name, and a group of men with phones in their pockets decided to be somewhere else. 27 words. For minutes and 11 seconds. 1 letter sealed and sent by a 19-year-old who apologizes to furniture and stood post for 6 hours and 44 minutes and decided that what happened to him did not require a report because the report he was filing was the one he filed every day in every joint and every held breath and every fixed point in middle distance. I am here. I am not moving. Plus, I'm still here. The secondary gate is staffed by a different guardsman now. I walk past it most mornings on my way to the cafe on Victoria Street where I meet contacts and drink coffee that I sometimes forget to finish. Don't stop, but I look.